This is a video to help you with dimensions of behavior and having a better understanding and hopefully being able to have a better idea of what to choose for your EBP project if you are measuring behavior. The first dimension that we're going to talk about is frequency. Frequency is the number of responses in which the behavior occurred. So think about count. How many times is it happening? Frequency is the dimension of interest when you want to know how many times something occurs. So for example, the number of times a student answered a question correctly, or the number of times a student talks out of turn. So if you see there, they gave you an academic example as well as a behavioral example. The next dimension is rate. So rate refers to a ratio of count per observation time and is calculated by dividing the number of responses by the total observation time. So think about it in terms of it being the frequency of the behavior occurring within a defined amount of time. So if I was interested in knowing the rate of correct responses, I would count the number of correct answers on a student's math fact sheet and divide that number by the time it took that student to complete the worksheet. So a count of 9 correct answers during a 10-minute work block would equal a rate of 0.90 per minute. Or if I was interested in how many talkouts happened within a class period, I would count the number of talkouts during the period and divide that by the number of minutes in the class period. So a count of 12 talkouts in a 40-minute period would equal a rate of 0.3 per minute. The next dimension is duration. Duration is how long a behavior lasts. It's a good dimension of interest when measuring a behavior that a person is engaging in for too long or for too short of a time. So for duration, you can measure the total duration of an entire observation session. So for example, the student was out of his seat for 43 minutes in a 60-minute window, or duration per occurrence. So the student was out of his seat for an average of 3.07 per minute over 14 instances. So there are 2 ways to measure duration. Intensity is another dimension of behavior. This refers to the strength of intensity of the behavior. So an example of an intensity scale could be if it's a mild behavior, disruptive but not dangerous. Moderate might be verbal or physical threats and or destructive to the physical environment. Severe might be poses a physical danger to students and or others. So some examples of these mild, moderate, and severe behaviors might be a student refuses to do work and taps their foot and pencils. Moderate might be a student ripping up pages in a book and throwing it across the room. Severe might be the student striking peers with sufficient force to cause bruising, or the student grabs the peer around their neck in an attempt to choke him or her. One important thing to remember about intensity is that if you're using a numbered scale, for example, like 1 to 5, be sure to indicate the specific definitions for each numerical value. Latency is the next dimension of behavior, and that is the amount of time it took for a behavior to occur or to be initiated. Latency is a good dimension when you are interested in the length of time between when a behavior is requested, so the stimulus, and when it actually begins, which is the response. So for example, wanting to know how long it takes a student to begin writing after the teacher explains the writing task and asks the student to begin would be the latency period. Topography is another dimension of behavior, and that is what a behavior looks like or doesn't look like. So more specifically, it's the behavior's shape and form. For example, you may be interested in the letter writing skills of a student or specifically what melting down does or does not look like. Now we're going to talk about selecting a measurement system. So does the performance of the behavior take about the same length of time as every other time? If so, this would be more of a uniform behavior, for example, like swearing or talkouts. For this, you may want a more event-based recording system, such as frequency recording, where you can record the number of times the behavior occurred and then possibly convert to a rate if possible. This can also be used in instances of wanting to record the intensity of behaviors. Selecting a measurement continued. If you are measuring behaviors that vary in length of time, so for example, time on task, out-of-seat behavior, you will need to use more of an event-based or time-based recording system. So time sampling is a way of collecting information that involves observing the behavior for a particular time interval to see whether or not it occurred. There are 3 types of time sampling. The first one is whole interval recording. That's recording whether or not the behavior was performed the entire period of the interval. So an example of whole interval recording would be if in a 15-minute period of time you are recording whether or not a student read the entire time, you would mark a Y if they read the entire 15 minutes and an N if they weren't reading the whole time, even if it was just for 1 minute out of the 15 that they weren't reading. The second type of interval recording is partial interval recording. And that is when a behavior is marked for occurring in that interval if the behavior occurred at all at any time point during that interval. So if you were taking data for 15 minutes and the child talked out at any point during the 15 minutes, you would mark down every single time they talked out. It doesn't matter what time stamp it's happening at, you would mark down every time they spoke out. The third and final is time sampling, and that's a recording system where you record whether the behavior is occurring at the moment that each interval ended. So in a 15-minute observation using a 1-minute interval, you would record whether the behavior was occurring at the end of each minute. So if the behavior occurred at the 30-second mark, you would not mark it if it ended prior to the end of the minute. It's only recording whether the behavior was occurring at the time that each interval ends. This next slide is Let's Measure. This video is already uploaded to ReggieNet on 252 on week 3. At this time, I am going to ask you to please watch this video, which kind of wraps up all of the different dimensions of behavior and types of recording that I've discussed in this video.